Hi everyone, welcome back. This week we're moving on to chapter 10. So last week we finished all of the chapters on the court process. So hopefully you took your third exam on the court system, or if you didn't, you're getting ready to take it. And this week we're moving on to the last component of the criminal justice system, and we're going to talk about corrections. So we're going to start with chapter 10, and we're going to talk about the different forms of punishment that exist in the system for chapter 10. Okay, so to start out today, we're going to start with the beginning of chapter 10, and we're going to talk about this concept of intermediate sanctions, or what we would call community corrections. Okay, so in the last chapter we talked about the steps in the process, and one of the steps we talked about is if you are found guilty of the crime, then they schedule a sentencing hearing, and you go and the judge would determine your punishment at the sentencing hearing. And now we're going to talk about what are some of those options for punishment. So you obviously can't divide into a group because you're on a video, but just to get you thinking, I want you to think of different alternative punishments that you could use for these different offenses. So jaywalking, driving without a license, public intoxication, disorderly conduct, petty theft. So if you could not use jail or probation, what other creative solutions could you think of to punish the people? The sky's the limit. They got anything creative that you want. It just can't be jail and it can't be probation. Okay, so those are what we call intermediate sanctions. So this is just kind of fun, different intermediate sanctions that judges have used in the past. A man convicted of illegal multi-year deer poaching was sentenced to watch Bambi once a month. A teenager had a mixed sentence of listening to 2 hours of Vegas King Wayne Newton for playing hip-hop music too loud. An Ohio woman was ordered to cook Thanksgiving dinner for 3 officers after knocking down a cop who was directing traffic. A woman was required to spend 2 mornings rush hours wearing a poster that says, "Only an idiot drives on the sidewalk," to avoid a school bus. So these are different funny, crazy sanctions that judges have come up with. So they're not the traditional punishments. It's not jail. It's not probation, but other punishments that judges have created over the years. And these we call intermediate sanctions. So what are intermediate sanctions? It's the use of different forms of punishment instead of the traditional forms. So sometimes they call it punishing smarter. So instead of putting them in jail and taxpayers having to pay for them to be in jail or even probation and be supervised, judges come up with these alternative ways of punishing that can save money and not cause taxpayers money and keep the person from actually being involved in the correctional system. Now, why are these intermediate sanctions good? Why do we want to use them? Number one, they're much less expensive to operate. It's very expensive to put somebody in jail per person. So it is much cheaper to use these types of intermediate sanctions. It's socially cost effective because it keeps the offender in the community. They can still work, they can still provide for their family, they can be support for their family. So instead of tearing the family unit apart, it keeps them in as part of their community. And it provides flexibility in terms of resources. So instead of having probation officers and all these resources that have to go, we allow those resources to be allocated to more serious offenses. So we're going to quickly talk about what are some of these intermediate sanctions. So a fine can be a form of intermediate sanction. A fine is just money that the person has to pay to court. Okay, so usually there's a fine for a lot of crimes. They could just charge a fine for the punishment, and it's just you have to pay money to the court. Restitution. Restitution is compensating the victim for their injury or loss. So if you have an assault and you break a person's arm and they have to go to the hospital, you have to pay for their hospital bills. If you steal something, you have to pay them back the amount of the item that you stole. If you vandalize, you have to fix the vandalism and you have to pay for any repairs. So restitution is trying to restore the victim to what they were prior to the crime, and the defendant has to compensate that victim for their loss. Sometimes judges order community service. Community service is when the offender must give time back to the community or community project. So they have to work for the community, for the government, without being paid. So they're providing some service free of charge. Sometimes we have electronic monitoring. So we'll let them go, but we won't necessarily have them be in jail, but we'll require them to wear electronic monitor on their ankle. So this is an electronic bracelet that sends out a signal, and they can track the person's whereabouts all the time to make sure they're not somewhere they should not be. House arrest. House arrest is often used with electronic monitoring. So instead of putting you in jail, we're just going to confine you to your house. So you're not allowed to leave the house. Sometimes they'll let you leave for school or for a job, but in general, all other times, you're confined to your house, and they're going to assure that you stay there by electronic monitoring. You can have what's called intensive supervised probation. So this would be an alternative to jail. It is a form of probation. But usually for more serious crimes that you may not usually give probation, you would give jail. We're going to make you show up frequently to your probation officer. Every day you may have to report, and you have to face that probation officer. So you're highly supervised during this probation. We talked about drug court when we talked about the court system. So you could go through drug court. It's that special proceeding. You're going to have counseling, rehabilitation. You're going to have to do drug testing, and you're going to have to follow all these procedures instead of going to jail. So drug court is an alternative sanction. You can have what's called shock incarceration. Shock incarceration is you might put the person in prison just for the weekend to show how bad that it is, to scare them straight in a sense. And then we'll let them out and just have probation or electronic monitoring or house arrest. But we want them to see what is in their future if they don't shape up. You could have boot camp, and I have a little video here. This is more like a camp, a school. So you would have to go and you live there, and it's almost like a military boot camp where you have to do physical activity, you have to do schooling, you have to follow all the rules. And the idea is that it would teach you some form of discipline and a form of rehabilitation. So it's literally like going to the military boot camp. So you have to do running and physical activity in school, and they'll scream and yell at you and things like that. You can have a mixed sentence. So a mixed sentence may be you have to spend your weekends in jail. So you can still be out in the community and go to work and go to school during the week. And then every Friday you have to report, and you have to spend your weekend in jail. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to think about these different intermediate sanctions and order them in what you think is the most effective to the least effective. So I want you to give some of them thought, like why would they be good? Why would they be bad? And if you had to rank them, which one you think is the best down to the least, why? So it's really just to get you thinking in depth about each of these different forms of sanctions. There's really no right or wrong answer, but I'd like you to just think about how effective that you think that they are. Okay, and then the last thing, we're almost done, this is a quick lecture, is I want you to think about using these intermediate sanctions. So choose an intermediate sanction and then explain what goal you're trying to achieve. So remember, we talked about goals of punishment, retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, restoration, and incarceration. I want you to say what your intermediate sanction is. I want you to think of what goal you would be trying to achieve with that and explain why you chose it. So here's the first one. Barney School District has several students who broke into school and vandalized it, causing destruction of property. They broke computers, shattered windows, sprayed graffiti on the school, and they pled guilty. What would be their sentence? So which intermediate sentence do you think sanction would be best for this? Why? Why'd you pick it? What's the goal you're trying to achieve? Okay. What about this? Larry's arrested for harassing a student on the internet. He has repeatedly sent harassing texts and pictures to the young lady. The school tried to address the issue, but the harassment continued and the victim will no longer return to school. Larry has pled guilty to harassment. What form of intermediate sanction would you use for this? And what would be your goal of what you're trying to achieve with that intermediate sanction? And then Kathy is a college student, is out with her friends on at night. She gets quite intoxicated and leaves the bar. She walks down the street, singing at the top of her lungs. She's arrested for public intoxication. She pleads guilty. What form of intermediate sanction would you give for this? And what goal would you be trying to achieve with that sanction? Okay. So that's it. The reason why I wanted you to do those last ones is because that's basically what your homework is for this chapter. So think about the different options that you have for intermediate sanctions, what goal you're trying to achieve, and that will be your homework. So quick and easy, fast lecture. The next one, we're going to talk about probation and parole and finish out chapter 10. See you soon.